it was every Christmas Eve. We'd always just revel in the fact that how wonderful our kids were and how lucky we were and so grateful, so feeling so blessed to have such a family. And now we're going to have another grandson. And of course, then the next morning it was all shattered.
I could only hear Joe's end of the conversation. But pretty much all he said is, "I'm coming, brother."
Hello, and welcome back to the channel. This is part 6 of our series on Laci Peterson. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're a returning visitor, welcome back. If you haven't watched the previous episodes in the series, you'll find them linked in the description so you can get caught up. Last we heard, Scott and Laci were preparing for a trip to Disneyland. To recap, the early 2000s seemed to have been good to the young couple. They settled well in Modesto, with both of them working well-paying jobs and becoming involved in the community where they purchased their first home. Scott became a member of the local Rotary Club, and Laci was active in several programs, such as the Neighborhood Watch, a traffic safety study, and a community beautification project. They'd spent their first 2 years in the house completing renovations, including installing a pool, hosting parties and gatherings for their family, friends and neighbors, and at least for Laci's part, trying hard to conceive a baby.
This isn't that much fun. It gets more fun.
We're just chuckling and thinking, I wish I could tape record this. The next year we'd see him and they were trying to get pregnant.
Finally, after over a year trying to get pregnant with Scott's baby, Laci succeeded, but she seemed to have a few health problems come up during her pregnancy, nothing extreme, but some dizzy spells, nausea, shortness of breath, and headaches. Though aside from the extra weight she'd put on since her positive pregnancy test on the 9th of July, Laci's complaints to her doctor seemed to be minimal. By the time the impromptu plans to go to Disneyland were set, Laci was very tired, and not thrilled about the trip, but she put on a smile, and prepared to power through the visit to see her in-laws. When they headed for Anaheim and San Diego for their Thanksgiving, baby-showered Disneyland trip, Laci was a little over 5 months pregnant. Laci's plan was to celebrate Thanksgiving and attend her baby shower in San Diego with Scott's parents Jackie and Lee and some of the other Peterson clan, as it was Ron and Sharon's turn to have Scott and Laci for Christmas, back in Modesto. But before Laci could think about her Christmas plans, or even get through Thanksgiving and the baby shower, she would have to make it through this last-minute trip to Disneyland. The idea to go to Disney came from Scott's older sister, Anne. While she was technically his half-sister, they'd only met 2 years earlier. Anne had been placed for adoption by their mother Jackie, more than 30 years before. Scott was introduced to an older brother from Jackie's secret past around this time as well. Scott's new older brother Don had been placed up for adoption, just before Anne. The relationships are a bit complicated. The following is Anne Bird herself, explaining how she came to be Scott Peterson's sister.
We share the same mother, so biological mother. So Jackie Peterson had 4 children, Dawn, myself, John, and Scott. Scott is the child that she had with Lee, or Pete, he goes by both names. I had a different father, and I was adopted before birth. I went straight from being born from Jackie to my parents. So I knew I was adopted, but didn't find them until I was in my 30s.
Scott never knew Jackie had other children. Not until they showed up out of the blue one after the other, a few months before he and Laci got married. It's not known whether Scott's father Lee, Jackie's husband of 25 years, was even aware of his wife's hidden past. If you don't know about Scott's dark family history, and who Jackie Latham was, before she became Jackie Peterson, it's a long story, but well worth listening to. Discover how the Latham name seemed to weave a tragic thread through the family, carrying a grievous curse through the generations. Beginning with Jackie's father John Latham, and ending with his great-grandson, Connor Latham Peterson. Check out the previous episodes in the series to find out more about the Peterson-Latham family history. Though as we're on the topic of the Latham clan, Let's discuss the 1998 Latham family reunion from a couple of years before this Disneyland trip. This event was held less than a year after Anne met her birth mother Jackie for the first time. It was also the first large family function she attended. Although Laci invited Anne to her wedding to Scott the summer before, she'd gotten a rather nasty reply, and Anne didn't attend. Again, you'll have to check out the rest of the series to get caught up on the drama surrounding this wedding invitation, but the bottom line is, Anne's story is rather opposite of Laci's, claiming she had never been invited at all. Anne did say that even if she had been invited, she wouldn't have gone. She said she would have been too overwhelmed, meeting so many new family members all at once at Laci's wedding. Strangely though, she attended the Latham family reunion just a few months later. And she didn't seem to have any trouble meeting a large group of new family members at all by then. And although she seemed to get on rather well with the extended family she'd never known, it turns out, she had a lot to say about the Lathams. Somewhat ironically, she said the Lathams were a gossipy clan, with bushy caterpillar eyebrows. And lots of family dirt. She described how she fit right in with her double-tongued new relatives as they whispered about who in the family was or and who was the family drunk. At this reunion, Anne mockingly referred to Scott as the golden boy and said he seemed to take offense. He didn't say anything, but she assumed that he must have gotten irritated because he took the nickname so seriously. But it could have been that he found it condescending as well. Although his mother Jackie may have called him her golden boy, which was probably still a bit embarrassing for him, she took the liberty because she was his mother, and Jackie didn't say it in a mocking way. When Jackie called Scott her golden boy, she meant it. But Scott must not have been too agitated by Anne's remark at the reunion, and by this time, the new siblings seemed to be hitting it off quite well. In fact, she was totally charmed by him. Scott even began to refer to Anne as sis. But, contrary to the uncomfortable feeling she got when Jackie introduced Anne as her daughter, when Scott called her sis, she embraced the designation. Anne said she was uncomfortable with Jackie's introduction, because she already had a mother, her adopted mother, Jerry. But, Anne had taken to Scott instantly, and unlike Jackie, she had no trouble with him claiming her as family, even though she already had a brother she was very close with from her adopted family as well. Anne felt an instant connection with Scott and said he seemed genuine and trustworthy. Scott would give his new sis undivided attention, and seemed totally absorbed in whatever she was speaking about, even if the topic was trivial and mundane. He would also maintain strong eye contact during their conversations, and she appreciated his focus and attention. Though later she would acquire a much more twisted perception of these traits. After meeting Laci during a trip to Carmel, Anne began to wonder if Scott had become a good listener, because Laci was such a good talker. Laci was full of energy on the trip, and as always, she burned some of it off with her chatter. She asked Anne all about herself, and her job, and her family, and told her she looked forward to being good girlfriends with her. Anne says Laci didn't seem to talk out of nervousness, but because she was happy. And while Laci was naturally social and inclusive, she was surely trying to make a connection with her new sister-in-law as well. And she was trying to adapt well enough to do that, in what would generally be described as an unusual, and even awkward reunion with the Petersons, a family Laci herself was just getting comfortable with. Anne describes Laci as a kick in the pants. She also said she enjoyed being around Scott and Laci together, because she loved the way they loved each other, though there would only be a handful of such encounters. On the few occasions she did observe them together, she said they seemed made for one another, blissfully happy, and absolutely in love. Much the same as everyone else who knew the couple. She also said that they were both lucky to have found each other. That Laci was lucky to find such a classy, cultured, and caring man as Scott, and that Scott was very fortunate to have found a doll-like bride, who was so warm, and full of life. But her descriptions of the family, especially Scott, as we get later in the series, will begin to change drastically. For now, Anne's negative focus will turn to Jackie. But even Laci doesn't escape a bit of negative feedback from her new sister-in-law. Anne doesn't waste any time concluding that Jackie never thought Laci, or anyone else for that matter, was good enough for her golden boy, Scott. And she sets up a few examples intended to illustrate the annoyance and dismissive attitude she said Jackie had for Laci. The first incident she described was during the trip to Carmel, where Anne met Laci for the first time. After their first night at the inn, Anne awoke to find her breakfast had already been delivered to her room. Muffins, pastries, and fresh juice were beautifully arranged in a basket waiting for her when she opened the door. Later, Jackie let her know they'd all gotten one that morning, from the hotel, and Anne remarked about how lovely the display was in the basket. At this, Jackie rolled her eyes and brought up Laci, who had embellished her and Scott's basket even further, making it even more beautiful. "You should have seen Laci's basket," she said, making a face. "Laci always has to redo everything. She's a perfectionist. You give her something perfect, but she'll still find a way to improve it." The second incident is somewhat similar, and happened during the family reunion trip to the Shell Beach Motel in La Jolla. You faithful listeners will remember, this is the same hotel where Anne and Jackie met for the first time, just a year prior. Walking with Jackie along one of the paths between their cottage-like rooms, Anne spotted a trail of rose petals and pointed it out. Jackie scoffed a bit and rolled her eyes, saying the trail led to Scott and Laci's room. "That's Laci," Jackie said. "Only Laci would take the time to do something like that." And again, and pointed out that Jackie didn't mean it in a good way. But then, Jackie relented and said, "Well, I suppose they are newlyweds." Then Jackie started to talk to Anne about Laci's childhood home of Modesto, where the young couple had just bought their home, and were soon about to start their family. And if the statements are accurate, there can certainly be no mistaking Jackie's meaning. Jackie told her, she flat out hated Modesto, referring to it as a cow town. She said it was, quote, "on the wrong side of the tracks," end quote, and she was convinced that Laci had persuaded Scott to live there. Anne recalled Jackie telling her that Scott and Laci were on the 5-year plan in Modesto, meaning that they didn't plan to stay there long term. I guess it was pretty apparent that Jackie had no great love for Modesto. But many have speculated that her real disdain wasn't for Modesto at all, but for the beautiful young wife who had taken her golden boy so far from the nest. During the Latham family reunion at the Shell Beach Motel, Scott teased his new sister a bit about settling down with her current boyfriend, Tim. Scott pushed her a little bit on the topic of marriage, asking when she was going to take the leap already. Anne teased back. She asked Scott why it was that as soon as people get married, they start to encourage everyone else to get married too. They both laughed, but Scott told her, "You'll soon find out." And it wasn't long before Anne did find out. Just a few weeks after the reunion, Anne found herself unexpectedly pregnant with Tim's baby. After describing herself as an old-fashioned traditional girl, Anne found herself rushing to plan her wedding to Tim. Though she said her main regret was only that she hadn't the time to plan her dream wedding. Instead, Anne held her nuptials in one San Francisco restaurant and had her reception in another. The Petersons, Jackie and Lee, along with Scott and Laci, attended both the ceremony and the reception. They had all traveled a fair distance, on just a few weeks' notice, to celebrate their newly found daughter and sister, Miss Anne Grady, becoming Mrs. Tim Bird. Laci and Scott wore matching outfits to Anne's wedding. His shirt perfectly matched the pale peach shade of her dress. And Jackie awkwardly showed up wearing the same shade of blue as Anne's bridesmaids. Aside from what they wore, she doesn't offer any further details about the family that day. No venomous comments from Jackie, or weird behavior from Scott. But Anne does pick on Laci a bit. At the wedding, she said Laci went out of her way to tell her that she loved almost every part of her wedding. There's no mention of what Laci might have meant by that. But Anne assumed the flowers must not have been up to Laci's standards. But this isn't the only time she mentions Laci's standards, in a less than flattering light. After Anne had her first baby, she got pregnant again immediately after. By early June of 2002, as Laci was just learning she was finally pregnant with Connor, her new sister-in-law was just a few months away from giving birth to her second son, with Tim. Anne said she spoke to Laci often over the phone, and that Laci would call her for child-rearing advice. Eventually, Anne shipped Laci a box of her son's old baby clothes. And when Jackie heard of it, she told Anne, "That was nice of you to send those baby clothes to Laci. I wonder if she'll actually use any of them." Anne said she ignored the comment from Jackie, and wouldn't even pursue that line of thinking. But then, she continued on to say, she picked out only the absolute nicest things to send Laci, because she didn't think she would use the rest. Which is basically what Jackie just said about Laci, only slightly less severe. Of course, when Laci received the baby clothes, She was very appreciative, and she called Anne with a very warm and genuine, "Thank you." After the birth of her second son, Anne was instantly compelled to take a trip to Disneyland. She made the call to Jackie, who made the calls to the rest of the family, with the invitation. Scott's older brother John and his wife Allison went along for the trip, but Lee declined to go. He said it didn't sound like his idea of a good time. But Jackie was game, even though she struggled with her breathing and her mobility. Aside from Anne, Tim, and their two very young sons, Scott and Laci were the only other family members to go to the park that day. But apparently, even a visit to the happiest place on earth didn't stop Jackie from lashing out at Laci. And it didn't prevent some weird behavior from Scott either. In her recollection of the family trip to Disneyland in November of 2002, Anne gets pretty dramatic right from the start. She said her husband Tim was nearly decapitated on the monorail bringing them into the park. There are many tragic accidents at Disney, and they do happen, but this feels over the top. She even says it felt like a movie when Tim bent down, and a branch came in the window where his head had been. Surely startling, maybe a bit scary, but a fear of decapitation? Directly after this, she says it seemed like half the staff came over and fussed over her son, when he bumped his head on a table in a restaurant, and when the fire alarm went off in their hotel, she said she freaked out. But this is nothing compared to her reaction when she lost sight of her toddler. Her panic at the situation caused Scott's behavior to stand out quite a bit as well. The entire family was gathered in Jackie's room at the hotel. It was their second day there, and they were all pretty exhausted, especially Jackie. After the fire alarm forced them all down and then back up 4 flights of stairs, the family gathered together to take a break from the park in Jackie's room. So, as the family congregated in Jackie's room on the 4th floor of the hotel, socializing and exchanging Christmas gifts, Anne suddenly noticed that her toddler son was nowhere in sight. An instant later she realized that all of the windows were also open. This is odd, that the windows, especially in a Disney hotel, would open enough for a child to fall out of. Any thoughts on whether this is possible? It must be, because Anne started screaming and running around looking for her little boy. Tim found him on the balcony, which had also been left open, but he was fine. Even stranger than the windows and balcony being open for the toddler was Scott's reaction throughout the whole thing. She said he didn't move a muscle or even seem to notice the commotion. He sat in the wheelchair she said he'd rented for Laci as a joke, and he did wheelies while he talked on the phone, never paying a bit of attention to the drama. While this does sound peculiar, a couple of things to keep in mind might be that 1, he was on the phone at the time, with what they all suspected to be a work-related call. Evidence would come out later to suggest that this call might have been far more scandalous than a simple chat with his boss. Either way, he was certainly distracted, with the wheelies and the phone. But the second thing to consider here is how quickly this situation played out. It may have seemed like an eternity to Anne, but even she acknowledges that it was over in under 30 seconds. It's still odd, though maybe less so? What do you guys think? Lastly, a quick side note about the wheelchair. Anne said Scott rented the chair for Laci at the amusement park, but as a joke. She doesn't elaborate on whether Laci used it or not. And she never tells the punchline of the joke. But Laci's mom, Sharon, said Laci did use the wheelchair while they were at Disneyland. She said Laci told her when they returned to Modesto that Scott pushed her in the chair through the park all day. Maybe there is more to this in the trial transcripts, as it relates to Laci's health at the time, and whether she was having issues walking long distances. We'll make a note of the wheelchair for later. The remainder of the odd behaviors from Scott and Jackie on this occasion as well played out over dinner at the Napa Rose. Oddly enough, the theme of the upscale restaurant, located inside of Disney's Grand Californian Hotel, is roses. They're depicted in the carpeting, the light fixtures, carved into the handrails and chairs, and even embroidered on the staff uniforms. As they waited for their dinner, Scott and Laci both got some hands-on time with Anne's youngest son, who was still just an infant. Laci bounced him on her lap for a time, and later, Scott sat the baby near him at the table. He fiddled with the baby's feet, while he talked with his sister. She asked him if he was excited for their baby to come. Scott said, "Oh yeah, I can't wait to play football with the little guy." But, when he said it, she said it came out flat and devoid of emotion. She said the words were right, but the energy felt like he only said them because he thought it's what he was supposed to say. Anne said Scott was distant that evening, and somehow different. She said he smiled when he was supposed to, and he seemed pleasant enough, but that there were moments when he seemed elsewhere. Then she said he ordered a bottle of expensive wine, and drank it all himself, never offering a glass to anyone else at the table. This doesn't sound like Scott at all. He was, by all accounts, including Anne's, always extremely polite, courteous, and generous. He would stand for ladies entering a room, open doors, pull out chairs, and even pass out menus to the women at the table first. And he would usually even pour the wine for everyone at the table. But not at this dinner. At this dinner, Scott killed the bottle of expensive wine by himself, while he watched Anne and Tim order multiple glasses of the cheap stuff. This place is kind of famous for its 600-bottle wine cellar, so maybe he just couldn't help himself. Or maybe there was some sort of misunderstanding. Scott and Laci also ordered a very expensive-sounding multiple-course meal, called the Prix de Fixe. It's described as, quote, the vintner's table chef's 4-course tasting menu, inspired by the flavors of season in the wine country, end quote. It's possible that between this very costly-sounding dinner, at an already expensive Disney hotel restaurant, coupled with a high-dollar bottle of wine he didn't share, that ended up on the bill split equally among them, might have had Anne more irritated than concerned. It is possible that there was confusion about who was paying what part of the bill, and even who ordered which wine, though Laci and Allison were both pregnant and not drinking. Either way, after he'd gotten near the whole bottle of expensive wine in his belly, Scott seemed to become a little more like himself. He and Laci savored and discussed each course of their meal together. Soon, Laci became excited, as the conversation turned to baby names, until Jackie killed her enthusiasm. Laci asked Anne what she thought of the name Logan. Anne said she loved it, but Jackie apparently didn't. From the other end of the table, Jackie said, in a very mean way, I don't like it at all. While Laci seemed to bounce back from the hurtful comment an instant later, Anne said she had never seen Laci's smile fade from her face so quickly. Tragically, this would be one of the final memories Anne has of Laci. She would never see her again.
And I thought Scott and Laci were a really neat couple, and I just absolutely adored Laci. She was something else.
So you met and spent time with both Scott and Laci.
Yeah, we went on a few vacations together and we're trying to get to know each other.
This was the last trip they would take together, and indeed, the last time the group would ever resemble anything close to a family. Once they were back home in Modesto, Laci became focused on her preparations for Christmas and her new baby boy, Connor. With just a few months left until his due date, Laci quit going to work as a substitute teacher, but found herself just as busy. Although now, she was a bit larger and much more tired. She must have known she'd be devoting her time to completing their Christmas shopping list, planning and prepping for parties and dinners, and of course, putting the finishing touches on the nursery. Laci hired some help with the household chores, even before they'd left town for Thanksgiving. Margarita Nava began working for Laci and Scott as their housekeeper, on the 11th of November. She was scheduled to clean once every 2 weeks, and though she would work for around 5 hours on the day of her visit, Margarita's services didn't include shopping or running errands. Laci was still making her own trips to Trader Joe's regularly, but beginning in late November, Laci began making frequent trips to the jeweler as well. And though she'd made a couple of visits to a local pawn shop in December too, they seemed to be fairly straightforward. She and Scott were at the pawn shop to sell a few of the pieces of jewelry she'd inherited from her grandmother. The clerk remembered Laci was a little irritated with Scott when he kept trying to hold her around her waist and touch her stomach. But other than that, and Laci forgetting her wallet, which was a bit out of character, the pawn shop visits don't stand out. But her trips to the jeweler are a little more intriguing. Laci came into Edward's Jewelry on the 21st of November for a heartwarming reason, but she told a bizarre tale while she was there. When Laci's grandmother passed away a couple of years before, she'd also left Laci a ring. And it must have been impressive, because it was valued at $45,000, and that was back in 2002. Laci wanted to memorialize her grandmother by placing some of the stones from that ring into her wedding set from Scott. And while that's lovely and very sweet, another interesting part of the visit is the story she told the jeweler when she brought the ring into the store. Mary Anna Felix, who was working at Edwards Jewelry at the time, knew Laci, as she had worked with her several times before. They chatted a bit, while Mary was busy appraising several pieces of jewelry Laci brought in from her grandmother's estate. At one point, Mary Anna mentioned that she was leaving on a trip to Monterey for a vacation soon, and for some reason, with that, Laci told Mary Anna that she and Scott were going to Monterey as well. But that wasn't all. She said that Scott loved ocean fishing in Monterey, and that he loved fishing in the Delta too. And then, Laci told her that Scott worked for a law firm in Monterey, and that he would often play golf there as well, with the attorneys from the law firm. Laci also told Mary that Scott was the one who wanted the jewelry appraised, and that he would be happy to learn that it was worth at least $100,000. Of course, a large percentage, if not all of those things, weren't true. Laci was probably just bragging to impress Mary, but this is still surprising, because it's in such stark contrast to the descriptions of her from friends and family. Please comment with your thoughts. The other small thing she said that stood out was that it was Scott who wanted her to have the jewelry appraised. Yes, she also said he was an attorney in Monterey, but there are sprinkles of truth in her lies that could mean that Scott did send her to find out what her grandmother's jewelry was worth. If so, the odd thing about that would be the timing. Her grandmother passed a good long while prior to this, but they'd never had estimations of the value done in all of that time, until now. Why do it now? And why sell the other pieces at the pawn shop after all of that time as well? The pawn shop clerk did say that Laci was cleaning out her jewelry box, but with this weird trip to Edwards Jewelry, and the strange story she tells while she's there, it's hard to guess what the motives are. Mary Anna also talked to Laci about several other pieces of jewelry that she'd inherited from her grandmother. One piece in particular, pendant, Laci wouldn't leave to be cleaned, because she didn't want to lose it. Mary Anna said Laci was wearing it each of the 10 to 12 times she saw her. Another piece was a blue sapphire ring, which had a missing stone. The jewelers replaced the stone, and Laci wore it in place of her wedding ring, while waiting for the redesigned piece to be completed. She'd also received a diamond Geneva dress watch and a Croton dress watch. The Croton watch was advertised for sale by Scott and Laci sometime that year on eBay, and would eventually become an interesting piece of evidence in the case later on. The Croton dress watch wasn't keeping time, so she left it at Edwards to be repaired and picked it up a couple weeks later. Laci never got to wear her redesigned wedding ring, with her grandmother's stone, and it was eventually returned to Sharon Rocha. This last week of November, on the 25th, Laci had another prenatal appointment with her doctor. She complained about her hands and feet swelling up a bit, but aside from this, the appointment was routine. But Laci didn't make an entry into her pregnancy diary after this appointment, as she had with most of the others. The next time she wrote in her diary, to baby Connor, was on the 1st of December. December 1st. On our trip down to San Diego for Thanksgiving, Scott and I came up with another name for the baby, Logan. We will have to start using the name and speaking to the baby to see if we like the sound of it. Connor is still on our minds, but we are not certain. If we do go with Connor, we need to decide on how we're going to spell it, with ER or OR. This is the last entry Laci would make in her pregnancy diary. The 1st of December was also the day Scott learned that his application to join the local country club had been approved. The membership fee to the Del Rio was in the neighborhood of $20,000. Scott's father, Lee, said that the one-time membership fee had been paid by him as a gift for Scott and Laci. Other evidence shows that Scott was paying smaller fees to the club on a monthly basis as well. Either way, the gift was intended for both of them, though Laci was already joking about Scott being gone at the golf course even more often, now that they were members there. Over the weekend of the 7th and 8th, Scott took a trip to the San Francisco Bay to go sailing with a few other guys. The next day, he bought himself a boat. Bruce and Christine Peterson had their Sears game fisher, along with the trailer and some accessories, listed for sale in the newspaper. When Scott saw the ad on the 8th, he called Bruce and told him he was very interested. But Bruce required cash as payment. Scott asked if Bruce could hold it for him until the next day after the bank opened. Bruce agreed, and the following day they struck a bargain Peterson to Peterson. Scott paid Bruce $1,400, all in cash. In return, he received the 14-foot aluminum boat, the trailer, and the 15-horsepower outboard motor. Bruce also threw in 2 life jackets, 2 seat cushions, 1 oar, 1 6-gallon gas tank, a battery, a fish finder, a small trolling motor, a tan-colored boat cover, and 2 spare tires, 1 in the boat, and 1 attached to the trailer. Bruce Peterson didn't sell Scott the anchors, because he planned to buy another boat. Bruce said he had never taken the boat in seawater, and the last time he used it was in September. This was apparently the 4th boat Scott had ever owned. A few days later, early in the morning on the 10th of December, Scott noticed his neighbor across the street had a flat tire. Susan Medina was on her way to an appointment when she realized it. When Scott came over and offered to fix it, she told him thank you for the offer, but she was nearly late as it was. Fixing the tire wouldn't keep her from missing her appointment. So, instead of changing her tire, Scott drove Susan where she needed to go that morning, instead. On the 13th of December, Laci picked up her Croton dress watch from Edwards Jewelry. The jeweler cleaned it and repaired the timekeeping mechanism. Mary Anna noticed Laci's nails were painted a pretty shade of red, which was a change from the usual clear polish she saw her wear. Mary could still smell the polish on Laci's fingers, and she commented on her freshly painted nails. Laci told her she had plans the next evening to attend a Christmas party, and she'd chosen the color for the occasion. Mary said Laci seemed happy, and the two of them shared a laugh as she left the store that day. Laci felt Mary watching her as she walked out and turned around. Mary smiled at her and said, "You're starting to waddle." Laci laughed. But Mary told her as she exited the store, "You look cute pregnant." Laci jokingly called back in reply, "Yeah, right?" The next evening, the 14th, Laci attended Stacy Boyer's Christmas party, alone. Scott backed out of the party earlier that day, saying he had a meeting with a client in San Francisco. But the weather was horrible that night, and Sharon asked him if he couldn't postpone the meeting to avoid the treacherous drive and accompany Laci to the party, but he said it couldn't be done. His client was only going to be in town for one night, and had a brief window to meet with Scott between flights. And so, with her freshly painted nails, and the dressy pantsuit she'd picked up at Motherhood Maternity weeks before, Laci drove herself in the howling wind and rain, to celebrate Christmas with her dearest friends. She didn't stay for the whole party, only an hour and a half or so, and she spent most of the time sitting in Stacy's recliner, but she seemed to be in good spirits. She told her friend Lori that she was beyond excited for baby Connor to arrive, but that she was also very tired. 2 days later, she and Scott hosted Sharon and Ron for dinner. Scott was supposed to make his famous lasagna for the family, and though he'd made it home in time to eat dinner with them, he hadn't had enough time to cook. Laci served a frozen last-minute lasagna instead, which she apologized for, as they sat down to eat. Sharon said she didn't mind, and that she actually preferred the frozen version over Scott's. Yes, it's an odd detail to mention, but it might be relevant to what goes on with Scott, Laci, and Sharon, just a couple of days later, so just keep the lasagna in mind for a bit. Once they'd finished eating the frozen lasagna, Laci took her mother to Connor's nursery. They talked about baby Connor and how much they both looked forward to finally holding him. Laci showed her mom the gifts from her baby shower with Scott's family, and the progress on the nursery. She said she'd been having restless sleep, and she was keeping Scott awake at night tossing and turning. Laci said it was so bad, she'd offered to start sleeping on the couch so she didn't disturb him, but she said Scott wouldn't allow it. He wanted her in his bed with him. Sharon and Laci joined the guys back in the living room to watch the second half of Sopranos, which was one of Ron's favorite shows. Ron asked Sharon, when he learned they were going over for dinner, why they were spending so much time with Scott and Laci lately. Sharon explained that Scott was behind the frequent visits. He thought it would be good for the new baby if they all spent more time together and became closer as a family after he arrived. Ron was happy enough to go, because Scott and Laci's satellite TV ran The Sopranos an hour earlier than his cable at home. This way, he could finish the final episode, and still make it to bed at a decent hour. As Sharon sat with Laci on the couch, with her hand on her daughter's belly, in hopes that she'd feel a little pushback from her grandson, Laci said something that would soon echo in Sharon's broken heart, for a long time to come. Laci told her that Scott didn't like to leave his hand on her stomach, to feel the baby move. Maybe she just meant he didn't like to sit long enough to feel Connor move. But we do have it from Laci's diary that Scott didn't seem very excited about feeling the baby move when they spoke to the doctor about it. To be fair though, Sharon sat with her hand on Laci's belly for the entire second half of the show, and never did get to feel Connor kick. It could be that he was just insensitive and impatient, but as we continue, it's going to get more and more challenging to stay objective and give the benefit of the doubt with Scott. Sharon talked to little Connor a bit before it was time to head home. She leaned in close to Laci's belly and said sweetly, "Hello, little Connor, this is your Nana talking to you. I love you, I can't wait to meet you." Sharon would never get to meet her grandson. And this would be the last time she would ever see her daughter, Laci. Her world crumbled around her, just days later. And then the truth began to come out, piece by horrifying piece, over the following weeks and months. And Sharon began to wonder if there was a lot more behind Laci's comment about Scott feeling the baby. It made her stomach turn. But on the 16th of December, all still seemed well, and Scott and Laci were preparing for another trip out of town. Laci called the house and reached Ron, who she cheerfully wished a happy birthday, before she asked them for a favor. She wanted to know if Ron and Sharon would take care of their animals while they took an annual Christmas trip to Carmel with Jackie and Lee. Sharon agreed to watch the dog and feed the cats. And then she asked when they were bringing Mackenzie to drop him off. They'd watched Mackenzie many times before and expected they would keep him at their house for a few days, as they always had before. But Laci said they were leaving Mackenzie at their house, outside. She just wanted Sharon to go over and feed him while they were away. Sharon says this is not normal by any stretch, and it really threw her off. Mackenzie had always gone to someone's house when he needed a sitter, and it was usually Ron and Sharon's. In fact, he kinda loved it there. But he had never been left at the house while they went away overnight, let alone for multiple days. She said Mackenzie hadn't slept outside a night in his life either, that he slept in the master bedroom. But now, even though Sharon offered multiple times to keep Mackenzie, and reassured Laci that it wasn't a problem at all for them to keep him while they were gone, Laci said Scott was adamant that the dog would be fine. Sharon said she could tell Laci wasn't happy with the plan to leave Mackenzie outside, especially in the cold. But Laci said again that Scott insisted that he would be fine in the yard at the house, while they were gone. So here's the thing about the frozen lasagna. Do you guys think this situation with Mackenzie and Sharon sounds a little passive-aggressive? Like Scott might be mad at Sharon? Could it be that Scott took offense to Sharon's comment at dinner the night before, about the frozen lasagna? It's a silly thing for most, but some people, mainly those with personality disorders, can be very petty sometimes. He and Laci were huge into food and cooking and owned a restaurant. He was supposed to make his special lasagna, but he was late. Sharon's comment about liking the frozen stuff better could have really hit him wrong, even if she didn't mean it to be insulting. The lasagna could have been the catalyst for not letting Sharon keep Mackenzie at her house. Whatever it was, poor Mackenzie suffered for it. Sharon has her own theory about why Scott left Mackenzie outside that weekend, rather than at her house, in a later episode. Subscribe, so you don't miss it. Sharon didn't describe any anger from Scott the night before, but she did say he reacted strangely when she asked him about his business meeting in San Francisco a couple of days earlier. She asked him how the drive was, in the horrible weather. Was it treacherous in the storm? Scott changed the subject instantly. He grabbed his wine glass and said, "I'd like to propose a toast to Mom, for having the most wonderful daughter." It was eerily similar to the toast he made on their wedding day. After Sharon agreed to take care of Mackenzie and the cats, Sharon invited Scott and Laci for dinner on Christmas Eve, though it would take several more days and a couple of more invites from Sharon for Laci to confirm they were coming. On the 17th, she and Scott left town to meet Jackie and Lee in Carmel. It was a trip the Petersons made every year around Christmas, with Laci coming along on their last several visits. While there, they talked about trading in Laci's Land Rover for a safer vehicle. We're not sure what the safety issues were, but Laci's SUV would continue to have mechanical issues over the following weeks. But car trouble would soon become the least of the family's concerns. While on this trip, Lee described Scott and Laci's interactions. He said, "You never saw a happier couple. Sharon checked in on Mackenzie a couple of times a day while they were away. On her first trip to the house, she thought Mackenzie might be a bit cold. She wanted to make a space for him by the patio door, so he could maybe get a bit of the warmth from inside. But he couldn't lie down there, because there was a wooden pallet on the ground in front of the door. Sharon moved it, so the dog could get closer to the door for warmth. She patted his head and went home. When Laci called on the 19th to let her know they were home, she asked Sharon if she'd moved the pallet that had been by the back door. She told her she had, and explained why, but Laci said Scott had placed it there for a reason, and he'd moved it back. She didn't ask why it was there, or why he moved it back, but it would bother her later. She would question this, and 1,000 other odd details, as she tried to understand how her world shattered, just a short time later. But for now, she hadn't given it a second thought. So, Sharon said she was sorry for moving his pallet, and she and Laci moved on to discussing some of the final details for her baby shower. The shower for Connor was scheduled for the 11th of January, and Laci had been back and forth on whether or not she wanted to have a cake. Her girlfriend was supposed to be planning and hosting the party for her, but Laci wound up putting most of the plans together herself, especially when it came to the food. During this call, Laci also invited Ron and Sharon to Christmas Day brunch. She'd planned to host a pretty large group, including her father, Dennis, her sister, Amy, and her older brother Brent, along with his wife Rose, and their baby. Laci also expected Papa, her grandfather, to attend. Sharon said she and Ron would love to come for brunch, but she questioned whether Laci was up for planning a big Christmas Day gathering, because she'd been tired lately. But Laci said she'd been feeling great, and was definitely up for it. She was even planning a special dish for the occasion. The next day, the 20th, Scott went to Stockton with his employees. He had 2 guys working for him now, Eric, who'd started early that summer, and Rob, who Scott had just hired in November. They'd all met at the Trade Corp warehouse space, near Scott and Laci's home in Modesto, before driving up to meet their client in Stockton. Eric and Rob went into the office portion of the building, but not the warehouse, so neither of them saw the boat Scott purchased on the 9th. But Laci visited the warehouse with Scott that day as well. Peggy O'Donnell worked in one of the businesses near Scott's, and she was essentially his neighbor, in the industrial park where Trade Corp rented the space. Peggy not only saw Laci there on the 20th, but she let her use the restroom in her business. Scott's bathroom was blocked with supplies for work, fertilizers and nutrients and such, the things he was supposed to be storing there. But it was also packed full, because of his new boat and trailer, which he had less permission from Trade Corp to store there. So, Laci was there on the 20th. Did Laci see the boat? Why is this important? We'll go over the witness statements in a future episode to find out. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The same day, the 20th, Laci also made a couple of phone calls. In the first call, she talked to Sharon about an upcoming doctor's appointment, scheduled for the 23rd, and her plans to pre-register at the hospital for her delivery in February. In 2002, it was necessary to physically go in to pre-register for a room on the maternity ward. It may still be, as it often includes a tour of the maternity area, the nursery, and the delivery rooms. They often require signatures at pre-registration as well, for things like insurance and verification that you understand the rules and procedures of the hospital, and the security on the maternity floor, especially around the nursery. Many hospitals require photo ID at registration in an effort to increase security, making it impossible to check in online or over the phone. Laci said she and Scott planned to take this trip to the hospital together, after her doctor's appointment to check up on baby Connor. And, Laci told Sharon, she'd decided. She definitely wanted a cake for his baby shower. Laci's second phone call, to her girlfriend Renee, was a bit more personal. She told Renee that she and Scott weren't spending much intimate time together, since her pregnancy. Scott reassured Laci he didn't want her to sleep on the couch because of her tossing and turning, but apparently not much else was going on in their bed at the time. Laci told Renee that wasn't a high priority for her just then. Understandably. The next day, Sharon was out and about, delivering Christmas cookies to her family and friends, when she called Laci, ready to head over with a tray of sweets for her and Scott. Looking back, Sharon wished she hadn't called first, that she had just dropped in unannounced because Laci told her not to come by. She said she couldn't have cookies, that she had put too much weight on already, and that if they were in the house, she would of course eat them. So, Sharon didn't go. It was a missed opportunity for Sharon to see her daughter one last time. On the 22nd, Scott and Laci were planting flowers. Well, Scott was planting flowers. This was generally Laci's department. She was still fascinated with flowers and found herself at home with her hands in the dirt.
Laci liked to be in the dirt, whether it was weeds or grass or a little flower, whatever, dandelions.
But today, Scott was doing the digging and planting, while Laci rested and pointed out the best spots for the perennials. Their neighbor Karen spotted the couple out front and went over for a quick visit. Scott offered to carry Karen's Christmas tree in the house for her, and Laci told Karen about a scary experience she'd had a couple of weeks before. Laci said she'd been working in the backyard when she became so dizzy that she nearly fell into their swimming pool. 2 days until Christmas, and just a little over 8 weeks until baby Connor was due. That morning, by 8:30, Scott was already at work in the Trade Corp warehouse. At home, Laci let Margarita, their new housekeeper, in the house to start her routine. She first dusted, then cleaned the bathrooms, using Clorox and Pine Sol. She then worked her way through the house, cleaning the bedrooms, the hallway, the dining room, the living room, and finally, the kitchen. She used Pine Sol on the floors. After mopping, she put the mop outside by the door, by the washer, to dry out. She put the rags she used to clean inside of the mop bucket. And she put the bucket full of dirty rags on top of the washing machine. While Margarita was there, Laci went shopping at Trader Joe's. She returned with 4 or 5 bags of groceries, which she carried into the kitchen herself. Even though Margarita offered to help, Laci declined. At around 9:20 that morning, Scott registered a private mailbox at the UPS store. He said that this mailbox was set up to receive business mail because of recent break-ins into the cluster mailboxes at the Trade Corp warehouse. But it would be revealed later that while it was used for business, Scott had other items sent to this mailbox in downtown Modesto that were very personal. At around 10 a.m., Scott returned home to pick up a FedEx envelope before heading back to work. At 1 o'clock, Laci had an appointment at the Sweet Serenity Day Spa, but she arrived between 12:30 and 12:45. Laci's facial waxing treatment lasted 15 to 20 minutes. The manicurist Tina said that Laci was tired and didn't seem like herself that day. While witnesses at the spa disagreed on what Laci was wearing that day, they both said she had a silver and gold watch on her wrist. The owner, Michelle Boer, described Laci as a rare pregnant woman. She said Laci was very happy through the whole pregnancy, and the only complaint she ever heard from her was about having trouble sleeping. Michelle also said Laci never had anything negative to say about Scott. At some point in the early afternoon, Laci was in contact with her half-sister, Amy. They arranged for Amy to give Scott a haircut that evening, at the salon where she worked. Amy called Laci again around 5:30 from Bella Farms, a local produce market. She'd been shopping for a gift for their grandfather, when she called Laci to ask for her suggestions for a Christmas gift basket for Papa. At 2:30 that afternoon, Laci had her last prenatal exam with her doctor. The visit was uneventful, with no issues reported or discovered during the exam. Connor's heartbeat was strong and healthy. And Laci was all smiles while she was there, delightful and pleasant as ever. There were no mentions of any fatigue, dizziness, or trouble sleeping that Laci'd mentioned to other witnesses. Nor were there any further complaints about swelling or shortness of breath that were noted in her chart in early November. Laci seemed happy, healthy, ready to celebrate Christmas, and even more ready to meet her new baby. As far as Laci's mother Sharon knew, Scott and Laci planned to go to the hospital for pre-registration directly after this doctor's appointment, but, as we'll later learn from Scott, they never made it. Hopefully some of the trial documents will help to explain why, so we can include that in a future episode. We do know that Laci decided not to make a diary entry after this doctor's appointment either, a pattern she'd seemed to stick with until around the middle of November. Laci's entries seemed to become fewer as her due date drew closer. In her first trimester, Laci was writing in her pregnancy journal roughly twice a month, with July, August, and September all having 2 entries. And all corresponding with her doctor visits and sonograms. Until November, when she breaks that pattern, leaving 1 short entry for the entire month, and nowhere near the date of her prenatal visit. And then making no entry at all after her visit on the 25th of November. December 1st, her last diary entry, is also somewhat short, doesn't line up with any of her baby appointments, and we have no entry on the 23rd, after she saw the doctor. This could be nothing, and it probably is, but it seemed interesting enough to mention. Could her dwindling diary entries be a sign of something troubling, or was she just busy and tired? If Laci was feeling exhausted, or something was troubling her, she was doing a good job hiding it, because at around 4:45 that day, when Laci called her friend Stacy to wish her a Merry Christmas, Laci sounded as happy as ever. Stacy said she was ready for Christmas and cheerful. Not long after she spoke with her best friend Stacy for the last time, Laci made her way to Salon with Scott, where her sister Amy was a stylist. But when they arrived, Amy wasn't there. She was still on her way back from Bella Farms, where she had taken Laci's suggestions to create a basket filled with their papa's favorite treats for Christmas. When Amy arrived at Salon to cut Scott's hair, she mentioned that the basket needed to be picked up the following day, before Bella Farms closed, at 3 o'clock. Scott offered to pick it up for her, since he planned on being in the area for a round of Christmas Eve golf. The Del Rio Country Club where Scott's tea time was scheduled wasn't far from Bella Farms. Amy was glad for the favor, because the pickup time between 12 and 3 was right in the middle of her work shift. As Amy cut Scott's hair, Laci used the phone at the salon to order a pizza to pick up on their way home. Around this time, Scott invited Amy home with them to share the pizza and watch TV. But she had plans with an out-of-town friend and turned him down. Before they left the salon, Amy spent some time showing Laci how to flip the ends of her hair up with a flat iron. And Amy, who would be the last person, other than Scott Peterson, to see Laci alive, also said Laci seemed happy. She was excited for Christmas, excited for baby Connor, and she was her usual sweet and bubbly self. They giggled together for the last time, as they played with Laci's hair. Before they left that night, Laci said she wanted to flip her hair up, just how Amy'd shown her, for the brunch she was hosting for the family. Amy told her sister she loved her, and that she would definitely be there for Christmas brunch. And with that, Scott and Laci left the salon, stopped to pick up their pizza, and headed home to watch some football and a movie. Sharon and Laci had been playing phone tag all day, but at around 8:30 that evening, they finally got a chance to talk. It was a short conversation, and it would tragically be the last one they would ever have. After leaving her mother's invitation for Christmas Eve dinner up in the air for a week, Laci called to finally confirm that she and Scott would be coming for dinner the following evening. Laci also asked about the guest list. There were insinuations made later about a possible conflict Laci may have been having with one of the other guests. But we'll get into that as it plays out later. Sharon told her the gathering would be fairly small, explaining that, other than her and Scott, she had only invited 2 others. Ron's mother and his sister. At that point, the only other thing Laci mentioned was that she and Scott hadn't purchased gifts for Ron's mother or his sister, and she didn't want to come to a Christmas gathering empty-handed. Sharon told her that her and Scott being there for dinner was the only gift they needed, and not to worry. Laci seemed to like that sentiment, and she bid her mother good night for the last time. Sharon thought for a brief moment that she'd wanted to ask about how the visit to the hospital had gone, to pre-register for a birthing suite, but she changed her mind. She would just ask Laci when she saw her, the next day. Sharon said good night, and told her that she loved her. "Good night, I love you too," was the last thing Laci ever said to her mother. From here forward, we only have Scott's account of how he and Laci spent the remainder of that evening, and the following morning. According to Scott, they watched the movie, The Rookie, together, and went to bed. The following morning, he and Laci started their day together, as routinely as they had 1,000 other mornings, aside from the fact that it was Christmas Eve. They were both off work that Tuesday, and they each had their separate plans set for the day. Laci had cleaning, baking, and shopping to do in preparation for the brunch she was hosting the next day. She also planned to take their dog, Mackenzie, for a walk. And Scott? Well, Scott changed his mind about golfing that day and decided to take an impromptu fishing trip to the San Francisco Bay. He was gone for 7 hours. When he returned home, Laci wasn't there. Her Land Rover was in the driveway. The French doors on the side of the house were unlocked. And, most startlingly, Mackenzie was in the backyard, still wearing his leash. It would be a full 45 minutes later when he called Sharon to see if she had heard from his very pregnant wife. But, as you could have probably guessed, she hadn't. This call from Scott brought Sharon's world to a standstill. And the nightmare her reality spiraled into after this moment would go on to nearly break her apart, completely.
Sharon Rocha's life forever. On December 24, 2002, her son-in-law Scott Peterson called to say that her daughter Laci, nearly 8 months pregnant, was missing.
Sharon would later say, she knew in her heart that something terrible had happened to her daughter and her grandson.
On December 24th, 2002, shortly after 5:15 p.m., I received a phone call and heard the devastating words that forever changed my life. Laci's missing. I knew in my heart that something terrible had happened to my daughter and my grandson. My world collapsed around me.
The chaos, horror, and pain Sharon would live through over the next 2 years, and the crushing silence that seeped in after, would come back to rest squarely on the shoulders of one man. And Sharon would be even more devastated when she learned the truth about that man and what he was capable of. As we make our way into part 7 of the series, we wanted to quickly thank you all for your patience following Laci's story up to this point. This is a massive case, with much more scandal, horror, and intrigue to come, but some of the most important elements are in these early episodes. Learning about Laci, who she was, what her experiences were, and what her life was like, both before and during her marriage to Scott, not only helps us to understand the tragedy, but brings us into Laci's world, which seemed to be such a beautiful place. One of the main goals of the series is to express who this lovely young woman was, rather than focus solely on the darkest part of her life. By listening up to this point, before she disappeared and her name became tabloid fodder, her memory overshadowed by the dark fate of her and her baby boy, you have all helped to shift part of that focus. Thank you for the support. Tune in next time, as we take a closer look at Scott's Christmas Eve timeline, Sharon's reaction to his horrifying phone call, and the response from Laci's community, when her family called on them for help. If you liked the episode, let us know by giving it a like. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to be notified when we post new content. You can also find us on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, all under Dead to Me or Dead to Me Crime. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe, be kind, and until next time, memento mori.